Hey folks, Madura Bob back here. We've been working on this neck for the past few videos, this neck and the box that it goes with, the bracing inside the box, all of that fun stuff. Now we're going to get into a little bit of shaping this neck. You can see we've got a nice walnut neck here, a ash heel, curly maple fretboard. You may not be able to see the curl in it yet, but once we get it finished up it's really going to pop. Got some ash trim up on the headstock. If you remember, we did the scarf joint. The scarf joint is actually inside the headstock here. The glue line for that scarf joint is covered by the ears on the headstock, so it's all nice and hidden. But if you look, what you can see on the back side, we've got a little bit of a glue line there. That'll be damn near not noticeable once we get done here, and it's on the back side of the headstock, so it stays fairly hidden. But we do have this little triangle of wood coming in for the neck here that's way too proud on the headstock, so we've got to get rid of that. So the first thing that I do is I scribe up at the end of the headstock a line here where I'll need to cut, so I'll put a mark there and then use my square to square it off like that. Now I'll just run radial arm saw right across here at the depth of this headstock so that I've got a cut here for this little triangle piece that I've got to get out, and then we've got to get out that triangle piece. Now what I'll do is just run back and forth several times with the radial arm saw, and that'll eat away at that just as easily. And several times I've used this saw, which is made for cutting off door frames at the floor. If you're putting in tile or something like that, you can reach down in there. That would work fine also, just cutting right across here and cutting out that little piece of triangle. So here I go, I'll run this through the radial arm saw and then we'll be back. So you can see now I've got it reasonably well knocked down. We've got a mighty high shoulder here, but the headstock is now nice and flat where I can come down with a chisel or a rasp and get that nice and smooth, and then hit it with sandpaper so we have a nice clean back of the headstock. Now this shoulder that's sticking up pretty proud, that's quite a bit. So we're going to get into shaping this neck and tapering the neck down from the heel end all the way down to the headstock. So this will trim all the way down to the headstock and then taper up as we get towards the heel, and of course we'll round it over. We use a few tools to do that, a lot of them hand tools, and we'll also, we talked about earlier, the fretboard is a little bit intentionally put on a little bit proud of the neck on both sides, so we'll hit that with the palm sander with 60 grit in it just to get it down flush. Okay, we've got the palm sander here, we got the 60 grit on it, so we're going to take this fretboard down so it's flush with the neck. You know, while I'm doing this, some of you folks might be wondering, Bob, why don't you just grab a plane and plane that fretboard down? Yeah, good question. Normally I would. If this were an oak fretboard, if this were a walnut fretboard, if this were most any other kind of wood fretboard, I would initially take that plane and plane it down, get most of the material down. But this curly maple is curly because it's got grain running in two directions perpendicular to each other. It's got grain running this way and this way. So if I try to run the plane across it, even if my plane is so sharp that it's dividing light photons in half as I move it through the air, I'm going to get some chip out on the fretboard just because curly maple misbehaves like that. It chips out just when you look at it. So rather than risk messing up the fretboard with the plane, I'm sanding this thing down, sanding it all the way down because the sandpaper doesn't have any chip out at all. Alright, so we've got this sanded smooth, sanded flush with the neck, the fretboard sanded flush with the neck, and you see those ugly epoxy dots I had to put in there are prettying themselves up pretty nicely now. So we got a nice curly maple fretboard on a walnut neck. I also cleaned up the back of the headstock just a little bit with the 60 grit on the palm sander as well. So now we need to do a little bit of shaping because as I pointed out, we've got a big proud shoulder here that we've got to take down. Oh, that's not quite a ½ inch, but close, maybe 3/8 of an inch. We're going to taper that down all the way down to where it meets the headstock, and then run that in a taper up to somewhere back up in here on the neck. So we're going to be the full neck thickness here, That's a 1-inch neck and a 1/4-inch fretboard. So that's 1 1/4 inch thick right there. That's way thick. We're going to taper that down towards the headstock down here. Now there are a bunch of different ways to do the shaping here. You can simply use a 60 grit sandpaper and just sand it down with the belt sander by hand or with the palm sander. One of my favorite ways is with a spoke shave. You can spoke shave, pull right up along, and spoke shaves are fantastic. They're kind of meditative, a zen kind of a thing. You really get in touch with the wood that way, and you can really control and get a very nice finish with a good sharp spoke shave. But we've got a fair amount of wood to take out here, so that would take a while with a spoke shave, as fun as it is. So I've got a little jig that I use here with the radial arm saw that is certainly not an approved use for the radial arm saw, but I'm going to do it anyway. I find that it works pretty well. It's really simple. It's really just a little piece of wood with a little shim. So what I do is put the neck on here, set the blade depth so that it's flush down here towards the heel, and then move it up onto the shim here on this piece of wood until the blade is now flush with where we're going to come into the headstock. So I'm in effect creating that taper from the heel up to the headstock with this shim piece in here, and then I'll fix the blade of the radial arm saw in place and slide this piece very gently back and forth to cut away all this excess wood. So I'll end up with a flat back of the neck that's tapered down towards the headstock, which I can then use the spoke shave or sandpaper or whatever to round over and get a nice shape to. So here's how I do it. I got the jig in place. I've got a mark here so I can identify where along the board, with the board sitting right here, where along the board I want the neck to be sitting. I take it back off, and we use the Magic Handy Dandy double stick tape. Pop a piece right here. That's going to hold the neck onto my little jig so we can cut. Squeeze it down a little bit. And we're good to go. Now my height should be about right for saw blade to come across without cutting anything here on the front end, but then that's on the heel end. But as we move towards the headstock, that blade's going to reach down almost as low as the headstock, right where the neck and headstock come together. So what I'll do is bring this out, back down to here, move the blade out a little bit, and then lock it in place. Find my hearing protection, and we'll make a cut. Move it out a little bit and do that again. And again. So you can see, hopefully you can see if we get the camera to focus, we've created a little bit of a taper here on the headstock, on the neck, going from the full thickness down here to the headstock. We haven't trimmed it out all the way down to the headstock, still a little bit proud there, but that's just a little bit of a lump there that's much easier to clean out with the spoke shave or sandpaper, etc. So we can smooth off the back here from all the cuts we put in with the saw, round to the edges over nicely, and we'll have a nicely tapered neck. Alright, I've shaped this thing up pretty good with the spoke shave and the palm sander. You can see we've got a pretty good taper on this thing, pretty narrow up here at the headstock. As we go towards the heel, it gets back to the full thickness of the neck. I've got it nicely rounded over, a pretty good profile, pretty easy on the hands to play. We're ready for popping in the holes for the tuners and giving this thing some final sanding and some frets. The tuners, we won't even do a video on that. That's dead simple. All I do is take a pencil, eyeball where I want the tuners to go. Somewhere around in there, somewhere around in there. This is a 4-stringer, so now I'll just put my square on here, Square those lines all the way across. And right about here, just because the layout works out here, right about at the joint between the ash and the walnut here, I'll put the center of the 10mm drill bit, pop it through. 10 millimeters works perfectly for most of the sealed guitar tuners. That's also a 3/8, by the way. 3/8, just a tiniest bit bigger, so it'll work just fine as well. I like the 10mm. So drill those holes. We've got the neck here ready to go. You can see, like I said, rounded over the neck. I rounded over the tail piece just a little bit here, just to keep it from having any sharp edges. As we go into the final sanding, that'll get sanded a little bit better, smooth. But that's it. We've got a neck ready to go. So in future videos, this is our neck for the resonator we're building. So we'll finish up that resonator a little bit later.